Hello there and welcome. Today we're getting started on the Alpine speedrun, or rather, more of a new player's guide. So in this video we're going to be playing as Alpine, who starts as one of the lowest rated teams on the grid. They have the 9th fastest car out of 10, and the board expects them to get 6th. Now, in this series, we are going to be focusing on this first season a lot of how the mechanics work, kind of tips and tricks. You can look at it as a guide for new players, for players coming back. But generally, I'm going to be playing this series a little bit slower so that you can kind of learn how the game works and basically all the functions they're in. As such, if there's anything that piques your interest as you're watching the video, feel free to ask questions. But the idea is very simple. We're going to take Alpine. We are going to try and make them champions within 2-3 seasons. And I'll be doing my best to explain why I'm doing the things I'm doing, and also how you can kind of play along yourself if you so desire. So, as mentioned, we're going to be playing Alpine. If you end up enjoying this video, I would appreciate it a lot if you would like to subscribe, as that helps me out a ton. Now, as I mentioned here, Alpine starts out with the 9th car out of 10. Only Kick Sauber has the slower one. They have 8 out of 10 in terms of headquarters, but they have decent staff and drivers. Now, the drivers are Ocon and Gasly, and they do have, as mentioned, some decent staff, so it should be fine. It says they have 10 affiliates. I haven't actually checked that, so we'll have to see. But they're actually a pretty good choice if you are trying to kind of learn the game. You are going to need to try a little bit harder. As mentioned, the board expects 6th. You are expected, or rather you have a car that's good enough for 9th. So you're going to have to keep that in mind. Now, I'll be playing for hard difficulty, but what I'm doing in this video is very much applicable to easy and standard. You can do the exact same thing, and you should be seeing better results if you're playing on a lower difficulty. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. Now, as we get into the game here, we should be a week or two away from the first race in Bahrain. As you can see, the mentality isn't really great. So let's just talk about what this little smiley face means before we go anywhere else. So mentality is in this new system that got added into F1 Manager 24. And it basically is supposed to represent how your team, or rather how your staff and drivers feel about the team. In this case, we have most of our staff and drivers, they have a negative outlook. We have someone who really doesn't care either way. And the way that mentality works is that they give a buff or debuff to staff or driver stats, and you can actually see it very well here in Ocon. He is 84 overall, but every single one of his stats except for his accuracy is under 84, which is a result of the fact that he has currently losing some stats, or rather he has a stat reduction due to mentality. And if we get this up on the positive side, he's going to get a boost to about +7 or +8. We're playing this in 1.5, by the way, just made that clear. Patch 1.5 makes some changes to how the AI develops, which should make them a little bit more competitive. But yeah, mentality, there isn't really too much to say about that. At the start, it is going to be bad, and it isn't really easy to get up either, because the way the mentality works, as you can see here, they don't like the contract salary, not much we can do about that. They're unhappy with the car, they're unhappy with the facilities. Facilities are pretty easy to fix. You just upgrade your buildings, which I don't recommend you do immediately for a couple of reasons. But your car performance is based on, for instance, this right here, 17th out of 20 cars. And keep in mind, this is kind of hard to race. It is an overall war stats, so we're going to end up throughout this series have a pretty low car performance ranking, but we're going to perform a lot better. Now, as I mentioned here, we can actually improve our mentality by building buildings. In particular, the memorabilia room gives a bit of a buff. You can see it here, +2 to staff and drivers mentality. And also the team hub gives a buff to staff mentality. Buildings also give a temporary buff when they're built. So what we're actually looking to do here is that we're going to wait 2, 3, maybe 4 races before we start building any buildings in order to get that temporary buff to our mentality, which also is a stat buff, a pretty important one, when we have made some car parts to make our car better than its current position of 17th. So with that, let's just spend some of the money that we currently have to get started on some parts. Now, generally, the way that I do it is that I usually start with an underfloor. It's not as strong this year as it has been in previous editions, but it's still a pretty solid choice for a starting part. And in my case, I put in all the safety and wind tunnel into one part, because the way that I look at safety and wind tunnel is that it is a boost to performance, but it's not going to boost this design. It's going to boost the design we make after this one. So basically, we make one underfloor. it's going to be not too great. And then the effect of the CFD and wind tunnel is actually going to shine through on that second design. We'll go a little bit closer or more into that once we get there. Now, next up here, you're going to have some sliders, and the current, basically most important sliders are going to be your downforce, but certain parts have things they're better at. So for instance, for your underfloor, if we put all the sliders to the right, we can see that it has more effect on the high speed cornering than it does to low and medium. And what we're actually going to want to do here is lower the drag reduction, which is actually just top speed. And we want to lower airflow sensitivity, which is how good your car is at following another car. Now, the reasoning here is very simple. We lower airflow sensitivity because it doesn't matter if we're good at following another car if that car also isn't scoring points. So we want to make our car faster by focusing on cornering, which is the most efficient way at making the car go faster around the track. Now, top speed can be important for some tracks, but for most tracks it's not. So we're kind of doing a trade-off here. We're going to make our car extremely strong at cornering tracks, a little bit weaker at top speed tracks, and pretty weak at following. But it's going to allow us to score a good bunch of points in the first season nonetheless. We're also going to go ahead and turn the minimum lifespan down to the bottom, and the reason for this is also very simple. If we look at the cornering, as I go from maximum lifespan to minimum, it's a huge amount of performance, and the cornering that we're putting in right now would be enough to boost us into top 10 or midfield when it comes to high speed cornering. Now, the reason why I'm putting lifespan to the bottom here, although you might say that it's a bad that it only allows for 2 to 4 races, is that unless you're really going for wasting money, and also I just want to make this absolutely clear, create a team, you have a way lower budget than in the regular 10 team mode. So this is not going to work for create a team. Have a look at one of my other guys. You can probably find, I'll post one in the description. But generally, in the regular mode with 10 teams, you'll have more than enough money to survive with minimum lifespan pass, and you actually will in create a team as well, as long as you are a little bit frugal. So we want to take advantage of the lowered lifespan to get a lot more performance. Next up, we're going to put 6 engineers on this project because, as I mentioned, we're only going to really see the gains once we get that second design finished. This is the first one. We're going to make another one, and we're going to speed it up by using engineers. We don't really want to use rushed if we can avoid it, and the reason that is very simple. It costs a lot more money, so we'll just do it normally for now. Now, after we made the underfloor, we are going to go ahead and make a chassis, a sidepod, and a suspension. And the reason why we're making these parts first is because they have the shorter estimated time, 33 days. Your rear wing and your front wing, while powerful, take a bit longer to make. So with that, let's get started on the chassis. And the chassis is very strong when it comes to your drag reduction, and it's very strong when it comes to your airflow middle. We're going to be sacrificing the DRS delta, and we're also going to be sacrificing the engine cooling. Now, engine cooling in this year's edition is actually pretty important because we have an added thing that's called failures or mechanical failures. So having high engine cooling is going to be very important to have, but on the other hand, we're going to be getting a lot of it from the sidepod. So basically, for the chassis, we're going for top speed and cornering performance while sacrificing DRS effectiveness and engine cooling, because we'll be getting this engine cooling back on our sidepods, which are way better than the chassis at engine cooling. And we're also going to get the DRS effectiveness back on the rear wing, which is far more effective at giving DRS effectiveness. We're also going to go ahead and turn the minimum lifespan down to, of course, a minimum. The chassis is going to be surviving 4 to 8 races. In theory, if you're lucky, you can survive the season with 3 chassis for each car, which isn't really viable. You're probably going to end up using 4. But even then, the performance gained is more than worth it here. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, we're going to put 1 engineer on the chassis design, and the reason is simple. The chassis design takes 10 days to manufacture. It's the longest manufacturing part that we have. So we want to get that project done a little bit quicker than the others, so we can get a little bit more basic manufacturing done, if that makes sense. Now, next up, we're going to design the sidepods. And as I mentioned here, for sidepods, the engine cooling is very strong, and we're going to be sacrificing top speed, we're going to be sacrificing airflow front, and we're going to be maximizing the airflow middle. And as you can see, that's those 3% that we lose on the chassis, we more than make up for here. And while we do lose some top speed performance, you can do this if you really want to, but if you lose a lot of engine cooling, it's more than made up for with the gains on the chassis. And that's basically what we're doing with these sliders. We are taking the pieces and maximizing the sliders on what they're good at and minimizing the sliders on what they're bad at in order to get specialized parts that perform to maximum capacity. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing with every part. Next up, we are going to get started on the suspension. And the suspension is generally very good at two things: tire preservation and to some degree top speed and cornering. Now, as I mentioned it, because of the way that we are doing things, we're actually not too worried about the top speed. So you can turn this one down, but honestly, there is actually a really good reason why you might want to do so. We already have very bad tire preservation, as you can see, and this stat has an effect on how quickly your tires degrade. So having a high tire preservation stat is actually going to allow you a lot more flexibility in choosing your strategies. So we're going to continue our philosophy here of getting more tire preservation to get a better variety of strategies. We're going to get cornering, and we're going to sacrifice a little bit of that top speed again. Now, it might sound bad that you're sacrificing top speed in a race car, but the cornering stats are just that much more valuable than the top speed stat by itself. And later on in the season, we can make paths that get some of that top speed back, so it's not really a negative thing. Now, after we got these 4 parts made, we're going to have to wait for them to get finished. And as you can imagine, by the time they get finished, we're probably going to be done with not only the first race, but also the second and even the third. So really here, what we're trying to do is make a car that can be somewhat competitive in Japan, the 4th race of the season. And these 3 first races is basically just experimentation. You can experiment with strategy, you can experiment with different settings to see what works and what doesn't work for you. And you should not feel pressured to finish anything above last in these 3 races. In Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Australia, anything other than last place is a win. Now, after this, we are going to go ahead and speed along, because now we're going to head into the next phase, which is sponsor negotiation. Now, solo here, level up, and driver development is important, but in my case here, we're going to talk about, we should probably talk about that too before we go into sponsors. So the way that driver development works here is basically pretty straightforward. Development rate describes how quickly they gain stats. In our case, Ocon has low development. If we look at Gasly, he has average development. And you can choose a set of stats here for him to focus on, and generally he'll improve these 4 stats over anything else. Now, in terms of racecraft, or rather just pure pace, reactions, braking, cornering, and accuracy are going to be very important for deciding how quickly he goes around the racetrack. These are the 4 stats you want to race if you want to ensure that he will be faster in the car. Smoothness works the same way as tire preservation does. Basically, the better a driver's smoothness, the better he is taking care of tires and making them last longer. Overtaking, defending, and control basically has to do with reducing the driver's chance of causing incidents, both when he overtakes and when he defends. And also, of course, it makes it easy to overtake, makes it easy to defend. And adaptability is very easily just a stat that represents how good your driver is on driving on the wrong tire for the occasion. Basically, you are on a dry, soft tire, it starts raining. How much time does your driver lose on a slippery track? The higher the adaptability, the less time they lose when the wrong tire for the occasion. Other than that, we aren't going to be focusing too much on the staff yet, because honestly, there isn't really too much you can do with them at the beginning. You can point the development somewhat, but we're going over the staff a little bit later, and I actually do have a guide for them, which goes a little bit more in depth into how they work. I'll post that too in the description. But yeah, let's head to the new sponsor system, which is a new addition for this year's game. And the way that this works is that before the first race of the season, and your second season is going to be a season start, we negotiate a sponsor package. Sponsor funding is split into 3 pools: the upfront, which is honestly the best pool to some degree, because this is the money you get the second you sign the deal. You don't have to do anything for this money, they just give it to you. Here you can have it. The engagement pool is split into 8 different pieces of cake, if you will, or 8 periods over the course of a season, which means that this number here gets split into 8, and then you can do certain activities, which bring a bunch of debuffs, to get this funding over the course of a year. Now, generally, I recommend getting as little engagement funding as you can, as it is just, again, a bunch of debuffs similar to 23 and 22 to get this money. Race day is a new way that race day targets are done. We'll talk about that once we get into the race weekend, but generally this is a safe pool to put your funding into. Now, in our case here, we're getting 3 packages, one that's focused on race day funding, one that is focused on upfront funding, and one that is focused on engagement funding. Again, I would really recommend not going engagement, particularly in your first season, and either choose upfront or race day package. Again, race day package is fairly determined on performance, but it does rely on how your car is scored, or rather your average car score. So it's usually very easy to get this money. And again, I'm going to talk about that once we get a little bit further into this season, basically by Japan. Now, secondary sponsor packages is basically sponsors that are added to your first one. And some of them come with mandatory activities. You can't avoid these. They will put them in one of the 8 periods. In this case, we have energy drink cameo for 2 periods, which means that 2 out of the 8 periods, one of our drivers is going to be doing an energy drink marketability campaign, which is going to lower his overall marketability. Generally, though, there's no negatives for really picking all of these. You kind of have to some degree in the first season because you only have 5 options. But there's one thing I like to explain so you don't get confused. Now, when it says mandatory activity wind tunnel ire, it'll tell you that you get 8.2 million. This actually gets added to the engagement pool. So while the game will tell you that you're getting 8.2 million in mandatory funding, you're not actually getting that. And I'll be talking about this once we actually get to that sponsor activity, but it just goes into the pool as a whole. And basically the game just explains it in a bad way, but you're not allowed to double dip to some degree. It's probably a little bit confusing right now. I'll go a little bit more in depth once we get that activity for sponsorship. Once you put together your package, in this case we can see our funding is 71.5 million. We get 10 million up front. We're going to get 23.5 million over the 8 different periods. And we're going to get potentially 38 million in race day payouts. We can go ahead and confirm that sponsor plan or sponsor deal. Then we have our sponsor plan, which is, as I mentioned, 8 periods of 6 weeks each, where we put in targets and goals to reach the engagement score. And again, the more money is in your engagement pool, the more score you need to get paid out. Now, in our case, I would really recommend you avoid anything with driver mentality, because mentality is very important for driver stats. Factory adverts is probably one of the best ones you can get. The Science Center advert, wouldn't really recommend that because facility effectiveness goes down. That's not good for your design center. Anything that does staff performance is generally okay, but if you get a engineer, anything that gives you less engineers, scouts, or generally anything that says your staff number goes down, avoid it because it's going to bug you out quite a bit. In our case here, we're just going to put in a couple of guided tours, a school event. That'll be enough for us to reach our engagement target. Now also, keep in mind you don't want to do anything related to simulator experience because it's going to lower the development rate for the next 6 weeks for your drivers. We really don't want to do that. So do keep that in mind. Once you're happy, you can go ahead and confirm it. And if you click to the right here, you can see which races it's going to affect. And if you go further to the right here, you can see that we're getting a couple of our staff members are going to lose some performance and facility effectiveness down. Now, unfortunately, this screen doesn't really give you all the information you need, but we know that the facility effectiveness down is a factory. We know that the staff here is the technical chief, and we know that the other staff is the aerodynamics. So we're happy with this sponsor plan. Now, with that said, there isn't really much we can do now. We're going to head to Bahrain, and while we're probably going to have a bit of a hard time there, I'm going to be explaining a couple of things like how you can set up a strategy and generally how you can have a good race weekend. So let's jump into Bahrain proper. And this is kind of what I'm talking about with the race rewards. So if you played 23 and 22, instead of you having up to 6 different goals for a race weekend, now you only have 1 for each driver. And it's fully reliant on where you finish. In our case, we're just going to say 18th or higher. And we're going to do that for both drivers. We can probably get 16th or higher, but 18th or higher is a fairly safe bet. It just means that we need to beat the Kick Sauber team, which in theory should be a worse team than us. Now, when it comes to race weekend itself, you can do practice manually. I generally don't, but basically the way practice works is that your goal is to get all of these five sliders here within the blue zone. And each time your driver goes out, drives for a bit, he's going to figure out, I didn't like that one, and the blue zone is going to get smaller. And the best way that I can actually describe this without doing practice myself is we're just going to simulate directly to qualifying. And by doing so, our AI has now done the practice for us. And if we now take a look at our car setups, you can see that it's 70% and 70%. And we can now see that, oh, we might need to try and move our sliders within these windows. Now, something that is new to this game compared to last year's is that the AI doesn't really respect your setups. And what I mean by this is pretty straightforward and simple. If you do something like this where you have changed your setup, you need to manually do the first quali for them to respect it. Otherwise, they'll do something that they want themselves. And you can't simulate just one practice anymore to do different setups. You need to do basically all of them at... basically, unless you do something manually, it's not going to stick. Unless you manually take control, the AI is going to be doing some changes to your setup, good or bad. So do keep that in mind. If I want these setups to stick, I'm going to have to do quali manually, which we're going to do anyways. Now, the benefit of doing the car setup here is that your driver starts at a higher confidence level, and as you can see, the benefit of that is that he gets stat boosts again. Now, the confidence boost can go up to +8 if you max out the bar, and the way to max out the bar is basically just do overtakes, do good sector times, basically race well, improve your position, things like that. And if you have bad incidents, if you get overtaken, you're going to be losing confidence. This is a very fluid bar, so keep that in mind. But managing your confidence can be very, very important, and qualifying too high can be a detriment because your driver will lose a lot of confidence early on. In our case, though, we have started with high confidence for Ocon, we've started with medium confidence for Gasly, and you might be questioning why. Now, if you look at Gasly's bar here, his his white zone goes all the way up here, basically 60% of it, while for Ocon's case, it just goes up to about 50%. The reason for this is race engineer affinity. Basically, the longer a driver is with their race engineer, the happier they get together, and the higher the affinity, the better the bar gets, basically. Basically, Ocon's bar is better than Gasly's, and that's because he has been with his race engineer longer than Gasly has with his. And honestly, this should normalize over the course of a season. Now, when it comes to qualifying, there isn't really any particular things you can do here. Generally, the way that I like to do it is just I like AI taking control. Immediately once qualifying starts, we send them out on one run to get what is called a banker lap. And usually there aren't too many cars on the track during this. Sometimes it's going to be quite busy, sometimes you can get blocked, but usually you'll be pretty safe sending your cars out immediately. Now, in our case here, we have a very, very bad car, so we're probably going to need to do 2 or even 3 runs this quali to have any chance of getting into the second quali. So what we're actually waiting for right now is if we toggle over here, we can see which cars are doing what. So IL means in-lap, it means they're on the way into the pits. Fast lap means that they are trying to set a fast qualify lap. Out lap means they are prepping the car to go onto a fast lap and then an in-lap. And as you can see, currently there are 3 cars on out laps, there is 2 cars on flying laps, and the track isn't really that congested at the moment. So this is one of those opportunities. If you can also use this, by the way, expected traffic. In our case, we want to try and get one more run in here. It's going to take us basically 3 laps, so we can expect to be done around here. Basically, we're going to pit here and do the final run. So we're going to send our cars out again. Generally, I wouldn't recommend to do what I just did, which is send them both very, very close to each other. You can get a bit of a tow doing that, but generally it's not recommended to send them so close to each other. Now, in terms of finding gaps to send your cars out on, that can be quite difficult. And in our case here, we've actually slightly mistimed it because a lot of cars just now went out on out laps that could end up blocking us, like Alonso. But it looks like we are in a somewhat good run here. And for our cars here, both of them improved their lap times a little bit. So it was actually a pretty good run. Now, as I mentioned here, these cars are they're 17th and 18th in terms of pace. We are actually outperforming Magnussen and Sargent for that matter at the moment. You can also be very tempted at the moment to use another soft tire, but generally we can't really expect to get through, and even if we did, we would most likely end up losing a lot of confidence. Sorry about that. Losing a lot of confidence very early due to the fact that our drivers aren't the best. Now, with about 3 minutes left on the clock, we want to send our cars out for a final run, and this is generally where you can expect to be impeded. You can try and send your cars out as the last ones in the train, but even if you do that, you are still most likely going to end up with some cars in front of you, which isn't a good thing because they'll slow you down, and Leclerc here is potentially going to slow us down slightly. Ocon is improving his time, which is what the green means. Yellow means you're not improving, and unexpectedly here, we couldn't improve enough to get ahead of the cars in front, which is honestly pretty fine, pretty okay. But in terms of handling your qualifying, there isn't really any like super tricks. It's pretty simple and straightforward. You can take manual control if you feel like that's better, but sending them out automatically like that is perfectly fine. And as I mentioned, our cars are fairly slow. We're getting a mental debuff, which is lowering the stats. So getting knocked down in Q1 is something you should expect for the first couple of races. Now, because of that also, for these first couple of races, our goal is just going to be survive without picking up any major damage. Major damage can get very expensive very soon, but for now, we're going to try and avoid it. So once we get in the race, we'll be focusing on that. But as you can see, we hit 95 and 97% of setups, boosted Ocon up to a +3, boosted Gasly up to +2, +1s. So again, setups are quite important to get that initial boost. Now, in this screen, you are going to be setting up a strategy, and here you are free to mess around. But the only goal that you really have here is pretty straightforward. You want to get the estimated race time here to as low as you can. Now, there are ways to make your estimated race time very low, like doing things like this, running conserve. But generally, you do need to keep in mind too that if you run your tires too cold, you're going to lose time, which means that this might not be too accurate. And also, even if the strategy looks like this, there's nothing that stops you from running full attack, say from here to here, basically burning up more of your time before you pit, which is kind of what we're going to be gambling on. Now, in our case, we're most likely going to end up splitting the strategy a little bit. We're going to give Ocon, say, something like this, 2 softs and a medium, and we're going to give Gasly the opposite. Now, the reason why we're doing something like this is twofold. The first reason is very simple, and that is that this way we avoid having both cars pit at the same time. But it also allows us to answer to, say, a safety car, a red flag. It gives you better chances to have one car in the points when an incident like that happens. So splitting your strategy can be very, very beneficial, but it's not something you're forced to do. It's just one of those things that can turn into an advantage. Now, also, before the start of the race, we need to, fix the driving options there. And we want to go, in this case, we want to mimic the strategy, equal on pace mode, do something like this. Generally, what the AI does, though, is do something like this. Keep that in mind, and that's kind of what we're going to do for Gasly here, because he's going to be full aggressive to begin with. And for Ocon, we're kind of taking care of the tires. We want these tires to last a long time, and the reason for that is very simple. On every single track, certain tires have advantage over others. And if you go into the reports here, and we go into the pre-race report, and then we go compound performance, we can see that an average lap time here with a soft tire is a 32.305, while an average lap time with a medium is a 32.887. The difference between these two tires is almost 6/10, which means that a lap with a soft tire already gives you 6/10 advantage over someone that's running a medium, or a full second over someone that's running a hard. And if we are curious about how long is the soft going to actually be quicker than the medium, it's actually quite easy to calculate. In this case, we would need to find the difference between the time lost from degradation, and in this case, a soft tire degrades 900ths a lap, a medium tire degrades 600ths a lap, which means the difference between these two is 300ths. So if the soft tire has 6/10 advantage, which is 60/100ths, we take those 60/100ths, we split them on the 300ths we found here as the differential, and we get 20 as our answer. That tells us that a soft run on standard and a medium run on standard, if both cars pit at the same time, one onto a soft tire, one onto a medium tire, the car with the soft tire will be faster than the medium tire for 20 laps. After 20 laps, the medium start to get advantage, but basically you can use this as a way to kind of see which tire do I expect to be faster. It's not something you really need to do for every track because, as you can imagine, the planner here kind of takes that into account. So you don't need to manually calculate it. You can just mess around with strategies here. For instance, we know that the hard is a full second, a lot slower than the softs. And even if we run them on, in this case, full attack, and we do the same, say, with the medium, then we go the softs light, we can see that a strategy like that would be 7 seconds slower than anything that includes 2 softs and a medium tire, because the hard is just so slow to begin with. Now, the fourth strategy here, strategy D, is actually a fairly interesting one. Strategy D is a new addition to this year's game, where the AI tries to give you a suggestion that, with the tires that you have available, this is probably going to be the quickest strategy available to you. So strategy D is, in this year's game, a bit of a suggestion from the AI on a strategy that you can use, and you can use that to build further on. In our case, we're going to go back to this B strategy, and we are going to be starting out like this. And we're going to be doing one more thing before we get started, and that is to underfuel as much as we can. So why are we doing this? There's 2 reasons. Generally, it's just quicker, but I'll be explaining the other reasons as we get into the race itself. But by underfueling, we are going to be quicker over the whole race distance, and we are also going to be able to save wear on our powertrain. But to get a little bit better picture of that, we're going to jump into the race itself.
Well, it's great to have. Here we go with the Bahrain Grand Prix. And it's lights out and away we go.
Lights out and away we go. So the reason why I said we want to underfuel, and this number, minus 14.3 kilograms, might look very scary, but the truth is that as long as we run conserve after the first lap, you can push for the first lap. That's perfectly fine. As long as you set it to conserve after the first lap and run like that for the remainder of the race, it's going to be the fastest fuel strategy for most tracks. And the secondary benefit that I was talking about is that you'll be able to run your powertrain at a lower temperature. Now, currently it is overheating at 115 degrees. It is going to do that at every race start, but you can kind of see the negative effect here, which is powertrain wear rate. This means that for all 3 of these components, the condition goes down faster because we're overheating. And of course, the more you overheat, the quicker you are losing durability, the quicker you're losing performance, and the quicker faults can appear on your parts. So that is the secondary reason why we're underfueling. But the first one is generally just because you are faster while you're under fuel. Now, the ERS balance assist here that I'm toggling off is basically, you basically are toggled on. It means the AI is in control of the ERS. They'll choose when to use it to attack, to defend, to harvest. The ERS is very, very powerful this year to a point where attacking can save you 3 seconds a lap, or basically make you 3 seconds quicker, while harvesting can lose you just as much time. So we're going to turn the ERS balance assist off just to have a little bit more control over it. But it's perfectly fine to leave it on. On average, though, you're probably going to lose a little bit of time over the course of a race if you keep it on for the entirety of it. Before also we unpause, we're going to go ahead and do one more thing, and that has to do with avoiding incidents. If you go into your tactics view here for your driver, you can see that they have don't fight teammate, driving clean air, avoid high-risk curbs. Avoid high-risk curbs is generally okay to use, but I wouldn't use it unless one of my components are in the yellow zone, as the main benefit you're getting is avoiding faults, which become way more likely once the durability of a component has gotten low enough, around 50 to 40%, that they turn yellow. That means that they are minor damage to some degree, and basically they are now much more likely to develop a mechanical fault. Now, what we want to do is actually turn on rarely defend and low overtake aggression. And the reason for this is very simple. As I mentioned, drivers are prone to crashing, and particularly early in the season, damaging your powertrain can be very expensive. We don't really have the money for that. Crashing is going to destroy your parts. So by putting our overtake aggression to low and our defend approach to rarely defend, We lower the risk of lockups and corner collisions while we have less defensive overtakes. We're not going to finish in the points anyway, so for these first few races, there's no point in not doing this. And also overtake aggression low. Less chance of overtake, but also less chance of risk of spins / lockups and risk of corner collisions. We're basically playing it safe, both with overtaking and defending, and that is helping us from not sending the car into a corner and taking damage or getting into an incident with another car, which of course would be very, very detrimental. Now, other than that you are kind of free to do what you want to do in this first couple of races, but as I mentioned, you can expect to be overtaken quite a bit. You are going to be fighting just the Saubers. Bottas is fairly quick, and in particularly in the first couple of laps here, the AI is going to be very, very fast. And the main reason why the AI is actually very, very fast in the first couple of laps is actually due to one of the things that we are doing. So if we go into the data overview here, we click lap history, and we click car condition, and we pick any other driver here, we can see the level of fuel that driver has brought with him. 88 kilograms for the Ferraris, 90 for the McLarens. So as you can see, we're not the only team that has underfuel, because if you remember, 80, 90 kilograms is basically what we have in the car right now. The AI also benefits from underfueling, and over the course of this race, you're going to be seeing that our fuel is going to go down into the temperature. We're going to go back to about +5, +0.5 on fuel. And also our temperature is going to go down drastically over the course of this race. Now, because the AI is underfueling, it's a pretty good idea to do it yourself. If not, the AI is going to overtake you at the start of races, because having a car that's 15 kilograms lighter is a huge advantage. And you'll probably be finding yourself kind of where we are right now, 17th and 18th, for most of the races, unless there is incidents ahead, or you come up with a tactical masterclass. Again, this is just, I say most of the races, but what I mean is Jeddah and the first 3, basically. And right, as of now, we just want to sit back, slow things down a little bit, manage our tires, manage our fuel, and allow the temperature to go down. So I'm going to allow the gamer now to just pass on 10, 20 laps until we get to that first pit stop, because there isn't really anything we need to do at this point. 10 laps later, and our temperature has now gone down to the white zone, 110 degrees. And if we check the powertrain now, you can see we no longer have that negative effect from running the powertrain too hot. Until we get that side pod on the car, this is basically how low you're going to be able to bring it. But once we get a side pod, getting it below 100 degrees is going to be possible. Now, we're also going to go ahead here and pit very, very soon. And if you follow the strategy here, we're going to be pitting in 2 laps time. If you see this line here, the little white line, it signifies 30% tire life left. And in our case, we have 43%. But once we hit 30%, we're going to lose a lot of performance. And we're also going to be, sorry about that. We're also going to be, once we hit 30%, at risk of getting a puncture. And if we get a puncture, the durability falls to 0. We're going to be very, very slow. So we kind of want to avoid that. So generally, we want to try and pit before we reach 30 on the tires. Currently, we still have plenty left, 42%. And as you can see, we are up into 12th and 15th. But that's actually because Sonoda, Alonso, Hulkenberg, Sargent, Bottas, and Show, everyone ahead of us has actually pitted already. So that is why we're ahead of them. It's not actually because we've overtaken them. It's because they've already gone into the pits. Now, in terms of Gasly here, he can probably do one more lap if we want to play it safe. And what I mean by this is, Gasly, remember, the soft tires are a lot quicker than any other tire around here. And the longer we can stay on one of those tires, the better. So, as you can see right now, we would be 3.2 seconds quicker after we pitted onto a fresh, soft tire. And that is exactly what we're going to do. And also, you can kind of see also just how much quicker the softs are, because Ocon is 5 seconds up the field ahead of Gasly. Now, Ocon is going to be very slow towards the end of this because of it, but that's not really a huge deal. Another thing that I want to talk about a little bit is overheating your tires and why this red number is bad. So if you look at this, we are overheating our tires, and it does give them more performance, but it also increases their wear rate. And what this means is that the durability goes down quicker. Now, the red number is scary, of course, but you can see that the durability loss, we can actually bring up the bigger screen to make it a little bit easier. The durability loss has followed the expectation. Actually, it's gone a little bit less than that. So while the red number is scary, it's only something you need to worry about if this white line would, say, go down here so that it's under the yellow line. And the reason for that is very simple. If the degradation is higher than expected, it means that we are overheating our tires to a level where we're probably above 135 degrees. As long as the overheating is under this number here, which is the maximum tolerable overheating, you'll generally be fine in terms of tire degradation, but it's going to massively increase if you ever go over this number. And particularly for inters and wets, it can be very important to keep your tires from overheating. Other than that, though, there isn't really too much witchcraft when it comes to racing. And again, before the first couple of races, there isn't really much we can do. So in the later episodes, we're probably going to go a little bit more in depth into race strategies with examples. But for now, the goal is just to survive these couple of races. And again, if there's any questions, feel free to ask them, and I'll do my best to respond. It might take me a little bit, but I will do my best to find every question and answer them. At this point, however, there isn't really much we can do. As I mentioned, we are just going to try and take care of our tires. And as you can see now, we have a blue number rather than a red one, and that means that we're underheating. We're losing some performance, which is honestly okay, because while underheating your tires is not necessarily a good thing, the temperature is going to go up. Every time you pit, the tires are going to be underheated to begin with, and as you do a few laps here, the tires are going to come up to temperature. In our case, these are probably going to be at temperature once they become 95 degrees or so, and we might need to turn it up to standard to get there. But as long as you are close to that window, in this case, as you can see, our rears are 95, our fronts are basically there. As long as you get them into that white temperature window, you're going to get tire performance up. And then you are perfectly safe in running any strategy you want. You can run light, you can run conserve. As long as the tires are in temperature, you're perfectly fine. And I can understand that you might be concerned that we are losing cornering speed, acceleration, braking force, basically, by running light, which means that we're slower. But remember, these soft tires are very, very quick around here, and saving tire wear is actually going to make us quicker than if, say, we ran standard or aggressive. And again, towards the end of these things, we can run attack for a couple laps, last 3 or 4, to run them down to 30% before we pit. But yeah, that is basically it. There isn't really too much to do this first race. If there's any incidents, we'll take a look at them. But for now, I'll just try and manage my way through this, and we'll see if we can finish close to 15th or so. Now, as we're getting close to the end here, you can see that our fuel is basically back to positives, but I wouldn't recommend pushing on the first lap if you can avoid it. We are going to finish 17th and 18th, and that is basically what you can expect with Alpine. It is the 9th fastest car, we don't have any upgrades, and we have debuffs to our drivers, which of course means that we're going to be a little bit slow. Now, we aren't too far behind 16th and 15th here. You can see it there, 5 seconds and 7 seconds if you add in this. So we could have potentially snatched 16th here if we played it a little bit slower and a little bit more strategic. But generally, just keep in mind that if you are planning to do what I did here under fuel, you are going to have to stay in conserve for the entirety of the race, unless there is a safety car. That is quite important to remember.
We'll talk about strategy in the office.
But yeah, there isn't really too much you can do here in terms of the first couple of races, because your car and your drivers don't really give you much wiggle room. Now, of course, with other teams, it'll be a little bit better. You can follow the development strategies and tips and tricks that I give in this video for other teams as well. There's nothing stopping that. But for Alpine and Sauber, your first couple of races are going to be a little bit painful, and the main goal is just to avoid picking up damage, honestly. Now, in our case here, we did actually get a little bit extra money there. I clicked a little bit too quickly, but we did get a little bit extra money because we completed the race goal of 18th or higher for both drivers. And that extra money can be quite important over the course of a season. Now, mentality-wise, I want to just take a little bit of time here to explain this a little bit better. So, If we take a look at the overall mentality here, it gives less affinity with the engineer, which again is important for confidence. It gives less development rate, which is important for developing skills. He's going to have less patience for contracts, and it lowers his performance by lowering his stats, which again we kind of have gone over. So we need to get this mentality to a positive number. And there isn't really too much we can do here because the way that the car performance works is based on a threshold. Even though we're the worst team on the grid, even if we get this up to basically third or fourth best car, he's probably still not going to be happy. Facility is easy to fix, other staff is kind of also easy to fix, but generally the way the mentality system works is that it works on overall thresholds. If your staff is basically 85 rated across the grid, great, it's going to be a little bit of boost. Are they 90 rated, even better, it's going to be a +3 for everyone basically. Now, your staff, on the other hand, care about the car performance of the staff facilities. As you can imagine, again, it's just thresholds. You need to reach certain levels to keep your staff happy. And when I mean thresholds, it's just straight up overall thresholds. It's not something you can really develop over the course of a season or two. The best way to improve things like, as I mentioned here, the staff issue, is just bring up bit better overall staff. Facilities, it's just going to be upgrading your facilities. And generally, it's going to take you a season to get the mentality into a permanent enthusiastic, which is the highest level. But we can work towards neutral and positive, which is, as you can imagine, a positive mentality over the course of the next 4 or 5 races. Now, first up, we're going to get driver development up to here, and this is basically now where you see your driver's real stats without the debuffs or buffs from mentality, so keep that in mind. And we're also going to be setting up a pit crew training schedule. Now, I have a bit of another video on the pit crew itself if you're interested, but basically there are two main ways to train your pit crew. You can train them for lowering error chance, or you can train them to make them faster. Personally, I prefer to lower the chance of mistake first, but if you prefer to lower the estimated pit stop time first, there's nothing wrong with that, honestly. There's nothing wrong with choosing either of these two stats. Car building is the least important one, so you generally save that one for last. The way that you want to make sure, though, when you train your pit crew is to turn on cumulative up here. That allows you to see the fatigue of any given day. And basically, when you're setting up pit crew training, the only thing you are really concerned about is the day before the race weekend. You want to get a good number on the well rested there on the right side. You want it to be somewhere between 0 and 10%. And again, you can use this to kind of see where your pit crew is at to set up training. In my case, I like to keep or just maintain the car building by having 1 or 2 sessions a month. And personally, I prefer to get the chance of error down first. But as I mentioned, it's perfectly fine to do pit stop times first. I just don't like the pit stop errors. And it's again, an honest thing. You can pick what you prefer. It's that simple. There's no wrong or right way to do pit crew, really. Now, as I mentioned here, the only really thing you can do wrong is to be tired when you go into a race weekend. And the reason for that is, if you go into tired, as you can see, the chance of error goes up a little bit. And if we hit this bar, which is weary, it goes up even more. And if you hit the red rectangle, you're going to get about 40% or so higher chance of making a pit stop error. So we really just want to keep the team well rested, somewhere below 10%, lower than 5 ideally, before any race weekend. Then we just confirm the training. Next up, we are going to head to Jeddah, and as I mentioned here, we're going to be seeing very similar results to what we saw in Bahrain, because we still don't have any upgrades on the car. So if you want to, in this race, you can actually go ahead and sim it to save yourself some time, which is what we're going to do. Simming does have its own problems, though. And the main issue with simming is that you can pick up mechanical faults a lot easier. You aren't there to manage temperature. You aren't there to take care of the car. So simulating, while being very, very quick, does also come with the drawbacks that it's a lot easier to pick up damage and it's a lot easier to pick up fault than if you were to personally manage it. And Jeddah is one of those tracks where it's very common to crash. So let's see if both of our drivers survived. And they did. 17th and 18th, we can be happy with that. And it looks like they did not pick up any sort of damage, so we were very, very lucky here. And as you can see here, we can now have a look at the race screen here. So this is us finishing 18th or higher. And if we finish 9th or higher, we're going to have to pay our drivers a contract bonus. In this case, we didn't. And we made 1.2 million or thereabouts from this race weekend. Now, we're going to get our first part very, very soon, as one of our staff here, I would assume, our sporting director, has actually entered demoralized territory. And that's actually a really bad thing, because demoralized gives a huge debuff to his stats. You can see that he's 84 overall, yet his highest stat is 82. Keep that in mind. It's basically a -7 to a -8 to his stats, and that's not a good thing. He's not happy with our team race results, and honestly, the way that that works, the team race results, is that generally that is reliant on what the board is expecting, in this case a 6 or above. So we need to improve, rather get better parts to improve that. But honestly, even if you get demoralized at this point, there's nothing really you can do with it, because you need to get a car that is capable of competing with the cars ahead of you. And that's what we're going to be starting with now by getting the underfloor. Now, generally, this first underfloor I like to make because it makes us a little bit more competitive. As you can see, we get a +4 here to high speed, which is actually one of the important stats for Australia. So what we're going to do here, actually, is we're going to make 2 of these rushed. And the reason for this is this underfloor alone can be good enough to bring us up to a 15th place, which means that we're going to get more sponsor money. And that's going to allow us to perform a little bit better, keep our drivers and staff a little bit happier. So even though I wouldn't recommend rushing or emergency manufacturing if you can avoid it, in this case, it is acceptable. Next up, we are going to design another one. And as I mentioned, that first underfloor, if we go back and take a look at it in our warehouse, before we make the second one, this first underfloor we use CFD time on. It gives us 33, 33, 76, along with a little bit of a debuff there. So let's try and remember those numbers and go ahead and make another one. And we're going to place the sliders the exact same place where we placed the other one. And as you can see, now we're getting 44, 43, 106. Generally, you wouldn't see gains as huge as these. The reason why we're getting these huge gains is because we put in CFD and wind tunnel time. And that's kind of why I'm telling you to, if you invest all your wind tunnel and CFD time into one piece, the next piece is going to be a hugely boosted because of it. And this can be very, very important in making you more competitive to the teams around you. So if you are using CFD wind tunnel time, I would advise you to use it on one part, because you're most likely going to have to make a design afterwards to get the full advantage, or rather benefit, of that CFD time. In our case, we are going to go ahead here and try and get it done before we go into China in 39 days. And we're going to need about 10 days if you want to rush make both of these, which is what we're going to do. So we put 3 engineers on it. The other 3 engineers we're actually going to put on our chassis, and that is going to speed it up by a day. That's going to basically just save a little bit of time, which can be quite important when it comes to managing your team. Next up, we're going to just speed along here, and we are going to get onto our chassis. Unfortunately, we are pretty unlucky here, and say it has a design center shutdown for 9 days, which means that currently it says 5 days. But I think after we accept this event, we're now going to be 14 days. These are some of the random events that can happen. There isn't really anything you can do with them. You just have to try and handle them as best as you can. And in our case here, it means that the chance that was supposed to be done in 5 days is now done in 14 days or 2 weeks instead. And most likely then we aren't going to be super competitive in Japan. Instead now we're going to be more competitive come China. So we'll have to see how we do there rather than how we do at Japan. Now, as I mentioned, the new underfloors that we're making is going to make us more competitive in Australia, but we're still not going to be super good. So if you want to, I'd say it's perfectly fine to simulate this, because if you're playing Alpine, you're not going to be fighting for points anyways. The only reason why you'd want to do it manually is to, again, experiment, which is perfectly fine, or just play it a little bit safe with the parts and the wear, as well as, of course, avoiding incidents. Now, in our case here, I forgot to actually put the underfloor on the cars before I went to the race weekend. That's not actually a problem. You can go into car parts, we can pick underfloor, and we can install it from here. on both cars, and that's not an issue. You just have to make sure that if you do things like this, forget to put them on the car, that you do it before you start quali. Because if you have done quali, you're no longer allowed to switch things like your underfloors, basically from the first spec to the second spec, the second design that we made. So do keep that in mind. And we're just going to simulate here to race to see where we qualify now with a little bit of a better underfloor. Maybe one of our drivers made it into Q2. Maybe, if we're lucky. And we actually ended up dead last, so it did not work out for us. But yeah, that underfloor, while it's nice, it didn't really give us the boost that we were hoping for. So we're just going to go ahead and simulate this race as well. It's just one part. We're going to need to get the remaining 5 before we are truly competitive.
Now after the excitement of...
And our drivers end up 16th and 17th. Both of them survived, which is very, very good. And Esteban actually managed to get 16th, which means that we're getting paid out a little bit extra money. But honestly, it probably would have been better if we still just stuck to 18th for this one. This is generally, if you take manual control, that it would be beneficial. Now, unfortunately, due to all of these negative results here, the driver standings, the bonus, everything, currently Gasly has hit a little bit of a mental snag. Same with Howard and Ocon too, for that matter. And since we do know that we are going to get some new parts in 2 days, in 6 days, in 6 days here, we can actually go ahead now and start upgrading some of our facilities. And the reason why we waited with doing these upgrades is because whenever you start building a facility like our helipad, our tour center, and our memorabilia room, which is 3 very cheap buildings, we get a temporary mentality buff. I would also recommend upgrading your team hub, your race sim too, to some degree, if you can afford it and you have drivers that can develop really good. In our case, we don't, so we're just going to focus the team hub. And as I mentioned, these 3 buildings, because they're cheap, there's no need to really upgrade anything else yet at this moment. If we now go back to our drivers and we take a little bit of a look, he's now down to yellow debuff. And that is because of the facility upgrades that we started, we have now received a temporary buff. And as our buildings improve, the facility debuff is also going to start going away. Basically, as you get close to getting your first set of components, in our case it's a little bit delayed because of the random event, you can go ahead and buff your drivers a little bit by starting the building projects. And again, we're going to be upgrading the helipad, the toll center, and mobility room to level 5 as quickly as we can. Now, once that chassis is done, next up we're going to use our CFD period. We got a second one, you get 6 a year, on the front wing. And we're going to do the exact same thing here that we did with the underfloor. We're going to focus on what it is strong at, which is low speed cornering, as well as the airflow front. And we're going to take all 4 of the others here and put back to a minimum. Now, if you remember, tire preservation, we get a lot of that from our suspension. And while it is available on our front wing, the front wing isn't really good at it. And the same can be said for dirty air tolerance, high speed, and medium speed cornering. It's really, really good at low speed. And that's kind of what we're focusing on it. And the airflow front here is actually a modifier for low speed cornering. So hence, if you do low speed cornering, you also want to do this one. And this alone is going to boost our team up 10 places when it comes to low speed cornering. And of course, once we have all 6 parts, our car is actually going to be fairly decent. Now, the way that durability works on your front wing is that if you put it all the way down, 1 to 2 races, that's a little bit too little. Instead, we do 2 ticks to the right, which gives 2 to 4, which is far more acceptable. And honestly, that works out just fine for our front wing. We still get a huge amount of low speed cornering, which is what we're looking for. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're also going to put as many engineers as we can on this, because we're going to be running 2 front wing projects. And once the side pod and our suspension is done here, we're actually going to get started on the rear wing as well. And with that, you basically now have a complete overview of your first upgrades on your car for every single one of your pieces. But we're going to take a look at it first. And as I mentioned here, the helipad, once it is upgraded, we just want to start another one. And over the course of these upgrades, we'll be able to bring our driver's mentality into the positives, get some of those stats back, a bit more competitive on the track. That is the entire point of why we are doing this. Memorabilia room is done. We're going to go ahead and upgrade that again. Suspension and side pods are also done, which means we need to manufacture them. But first, upgrade memorabilia room. And then we're going to head into our car parts development, manufacture. And because we got delayed here with our with our problems that we had, we are going to actually go ahead and rush one component so we can get one of them ready for Suzuka. Going to rush one side pod, and we're also going to go ahead and rush one suspension. And again, we're just rushing one because we want to avoid using Russian emergency manufacture as much as possible. And by the time we get to Suzuka, we'll also be able to actually get the chassis done. So one of the cars will have 4 new upgrades in Suzuka, which is going to make it far more competitive. Now, we're also going to get started on, as I mentioned, the rear wing. And here you can find a lot of top speed, and DRS. And again, this one is far more effective than using it on, say, the chassis. We also want to minimize low speed, medium speed, and airflow sensitivity, while we maximize the medium speed cornering, because the rear wing is actually pretty good at that. And also, similar to how we did the front wing, we want to do 2 ticks on the rear wing to make it last 2 to 5 races. You can just do 1 to get 2 to 4, but I prefer to do 2. That way you generally are pretty safe when it comes to your rear wing. And again, our main focus here is the cornering. Getting top speed and DRS is just a happy accident. Now, I would recommend just using 2 engineers on this rather than starting another Ford project, because getting your first 6 parts on your car is going to be the biggest boost that you're going to get all season. After that, we're still going to keep developing components, but these 6 parts, the 3 that we already made, plus these 3, are going to be vital in making you competitive. That's why we're focusing on them first. So let's go ahead and speed up until we get to Suzuka, and then we'll take a look at how we perform there, and also how the car looks as we take over another month. And as I mentioned here, our drivers are pretty bad in terms of the development, so we're not going to go ahead and they're not really developing, let's just put it like that. We also have a bunch of affiliates who are developing a lot better, but again, if you want to manage your affiliates, feel free. In my case here, we're not really going to bother too much about it, and that's just how things are going to have to be. In our case here, we actually have 10 of them. Duin is actually a huge talent, so you can mess around with him. A lot of these guys are actually huge talents, but in my case, we're not going to be focusing on affiliates. We're just going to be focusing on doing the best that we can in this first season. We're also going to set up the pit crew training again, and similarly to last time, we are going to use cumulative and set up our training schedule. Here we are with our setup, and as you can see, 1% well rested before we go into Japan, and a good 0%. Generally, you gain 9 to 8% fatigue, or rather you regain each day you rest. So in our case, we get to 0 before we go to China. You are going to be tired basically in the second bar here by Sunday anyways, but you still want to be as low as possible before you go into race weekend, in my personal opinion. And again, with the buildings that we've done already, the mentality has gotten a boost. We still have a bunch of negatives here, but the facility upgrades themselves are a nice boost to get the mentality up early. And as you can see, the 3 hours down on facilities is now just 1. And it is, again, because I mentioned, it seems to just take the overall levels, or rather the total level of all your buildings into account. So go ahead and upgrade your cheap buildings first before you do your expensive ones, in order to get a little bit of a mentality and stat boost for your drivers. Our first engagement plan has been completed, and with that, we get bit of money. I actually clicked a little bit too quick there, but you get paid out at the end of your sponsor plan. In our case, almost 3 million. Next up, we're going to set up our second sponsor plan, and again here, I prefer to do factory race day experience. It doesn't really seem to have much of an effect of how quickly you manufacture parts, so it's basically a free one. Engineer team size, avoid this one, never do it. Sometimes your engineers don't come back. And there's also one where they take scouts, so try and avoid those two. And again, anything that negatively affects driver mentality, I'd say avoid as the plague. I think we send our race engineers to help out this month. There we are. Toll center has been done, which means we just upgraded again. 150,000, really cheap, for a mentality boost that can bring in a lot more money than that over the course of the next 3 or 4 races. Suspension and side pods have been manufactured, and if we were to say put them on the car number 1 right now, which is the one that we're gonna basically just give also the chassis to, chassis is actually going to be done during the race weekend, because if we take a look at manufacturing here, it's going to be done in 11 days. We're also going to get started on a second suspension and a second side pod. That way we have them before we go to China for car number 2. Although it does say that it takes 11 days, or rather 1 day here, for the next car part to finish, and we're going to Suzuka, as long as we put the car part on before we go to quali, we are safe. And Friday is just practice. So when we get the part on Saturday, while it is during the race weekend, you can actually put it on the car as long as you do it before you do quali. And if we take a look at our car now, car number 1, we've already gone up to 15th, 15th, and 11th in terms of cornering. And again, these are the stats we're most interested in. So it's looking very, very promising already. As the rate target, we'll put Ocon at 16th. We'll put Gasly at 18th as he's still lacking parts. And we're going to do this race weekend manually when it comes to quali and the race itself. So in our case here, we want to simulate 2 qualifying. There's nothing wrong with doing so. It just saves you a lot of time. Personally, I'm not a fan of the practice minigame, but you're free to do it if you wish. And unfortunately, we're having a rain this weekend, which is going to impact us somewhat. But as I mentioned, as long as we go ahead and put this part on the car, which is going to boost us 5 places in high, 4 places in medium, 1 place in top speed, it's going to make us a lot more competitive in terms of our cornering already. As long as we put it on before quali, we're actually good. And we're still lacking 1 more underfloor upgrade, 2 front wings, and a rear wing. So we still have 4 more upgrades to put on the car. And that should make it a lot more competitive. But for now, we're actually going to jump into a wet quali and a wet race, most likely. Okay, again here, we want to send our cars out pretty early. And we can actually take a look at what we expect the weather to evolve into. In our case here, it is currently 2.6 millimeters, which means it's inters. Anything above 4 is wets, or basically 3.80 you should consider wets. Anything below 1 millimeter is usually dries. So in this case, it's definitely inters. And towards the end of this qualifying session, we can expect it to dry out a little bit. It's still going to be inters for the most part. So what we want to do is probably send our cars out last towards the end of the session. So sending them out now first is good for 2 reasons. We can set a time, and you can actually also boost their confidence a little bit. We started here, and after this qualifying run, we got up here. And it's very, very good to send your car out early to get a confidence boost. And in this case, we're actually through to Q2 with both cars as it stands. But as mentioned, the water is going to go down towards the end of the session, which means that we need to try and be the last cars out there once we get towards the end of qualifying. There is also a secondary thing to keep in mind when it comes to this, and that is the fact that there's probably going to be traffic. So even if we go out last when it's the least amount of water on the track, it doesn't guarantee success because there could be a lot of cars in the way. Let's just reconfigure and get ready to send our boys out there. And kind of what we're paying attention to right now is when the other cars are going out, and it's supposed to start pouring down in 2 minutes. Which would be pretty bad. So I think we're actually going to try and sneak out here behind Verstappen. The weather here isn't completely to be trusted by the looks of things. We've actually kind of mistimed the send out here. But at least we shouldn't be held up. And Ocon puts it in 4th place. Gasly puts it in 10th. So while we kind of misjudged there, we still did a good move. Again, it was basically because we thought it was going to be rainy. But that is 11th and 6th in the first quali. Question is, can we improve in the second? And this is kind of one of those things that can be very, very difficult. And that is when you get a soft thrown into the mix immediately. Because as you can see, it is going to start raining. So we need to set a lap very early. And if we can, set a second lap here as well. So we're going to send out Ocon. We are going to send out Gasly immediately. And as you can see, the AI is going to send all of their cars out, which means that we should have, for the most part, a clear track. And that is going to make it a little bit easy for us to set a good time. And if we actually can after this, we might want to send our cars out again to try and get into Q3. But it's going to be very difficult on tri tires versus cars that generally are a lot better. Although Ocon
14.
might be able to sneak in right now. Remember, Ocon has a fully upgraded car, while Gasly does not. So we're going to gamble here on sending both cars out again, just to be on the safe side. It's still going to get a little bit wet, but maybe, just maybe, they'll be able to slightly improve. Gasly is improving in the first sector,
P10.
and he did actually improve his time slightly,
Last lap.
but unfortunately he is still out. But Ocon made it into Q3 here in the 4th race of the season, which is a very, very good thing. But since no one can improve under the weather, the AI is staying in the pits, and we're going to do the same thing. Unfortunate for Gasly, but it's still pretty good. 15th with only one upgrade on his car. Now, we are going to actually go ahead and I think 2 inters is going to be good. There's kind of something you need to check too, that you don't use up all your tires in quali. In our case, we are going to stick to just the 1 inter. Rather, a fresh inter this quali. And if we take a look at the weather, it's pretty bad, but it's going to get better. So if you want to be real cheeky, you can set your first lap on, say, an old set of inters, which is what we're going to do here. We're going to switch back to that 87% 1 inter. And we just want to send our car out now to set a lap. And as I mentioned, the main reason why we do this is to give ourselves a confidence boost before we set the real fast lap. And basically everyone else has done it. Even though it's very close to wet tires, inters are still going to be best here,
Currently sat in P1.
which is perfectly fine.
Okay, mate, our progress is looking good here.
But you can kind of see it. We're still a long way away from Verstappen. 3 seconds. Now, this time, we want to definitely be the last cars out of the pits. So we're going to wait for everyone to leave. Well, I don't want to get overtaken by Paris, basically. So while we waited, still limits to how long we want to wait. We want to make sure we get a lap time. And right now, the AI might actually not be able to get that out in time to set a lap. And this is this is basically just a bug, but they stay in the pits for too long. But it's a bug that we can take massive advantage of right now. And that's kind of what we're going to do. So let's see what we can do with Ocon here now, as he might actually send it on pole, just because he has way better conditions right now than the AI did. And let's see what we can do. Norris and Paris have some better times, and Leclerc is actually doing his run right now. He set it on pole. What can Ocon do? He's run a green sector 1. What else can he set here? Well, I assume he's going to set a green sector 2 and sector 3 too, because again, we ran the first lap at 390. This one is at 215. And while I've taken manual control, that shouldn't matter too much here. It's basically just to make sure that Paris didn't overtake us. We're not going to set it on pole, but maybe 4th? 3rd. And again, this is mainly because the other cars elected to not set a lap. AI can still be pretty wonky and wet qualies. And let's be perfectly honest here, at best we probably should be down here in 9th. So this is a very lucky break, but also one that could hurt us quite a bit because of the fact that, well, we're going to get overtaken, confidence is going to go into the negatives, and that is not a good thing. Now, as I mentioned here, when it comes to the wet tires, let's talk a little bit about how you can estimate things. So the race is going to start with 1.31 millimeters of water on the track. That is inter territory, 1 to 4 millimeters. And it's pretty straightforward here to see what you can expect. If the orange line is above the blue one, it's generally going to be inters. If the orange line is below the blue one, it's generally going to be wets. But it's still kind of hard to judge. You don't get a definitive answer. So it's just a rule of thumb. Sometimes it's wrong, but in this case, it should be inters for the entire race. Next up, we want to set up a strategy here to kind of benefit us with that in mind. And while running light on inters isn't a terrible idea, it is going to lose us a little bit of time. running aggressive can be very, very beneficial. And that is probably what we're going to do here at the beginning, so we don't lose out too much to the cars around us. And honestly here for Gasly as well, I think with how far behind he is, running long on that first stint could benefit us. Now, because it's wet racing here, we're going to go ahead and underfuel maximum. And particularly when it is inters or wets, you really should underfuel. Again, the main reason is you're quicker that way, but you also gain much more fuel back, or rather you don't use as much fuel when you're running on inters or wet tires. So underfueling is actually extra effective in these conditions. Now, in my case here, I actually forgot to switch the setups before quali. That's a mistake on my part. And that has also severely hurt their confidence, so don't be a silly goober like me and forget to fix that. But with that said, we are going to run aggressive, push, and deploy. And we're going to do the same here for Gasly, just for their first couple of laps here to kind of try and stay safe off the AI. But I think Ocon, with the car that he has now, might be good enough to get a point or two. And that's kind of what we're going to be hoping for. Lights out, away we go. We're going to put on rally, defend, and low again to avoid incidents, mainly. And with that, we are now ready. Ocon actually gets temporarily second place there ahead of Norris, but he falls down to third again. And let's face it, we have Perez, we have Verstappen behind us. They are going to overtake us at one point as Gasly gets overtaken by Stroll. And Gasly here is not going to have a good time. Even though he has one upgrade on the car, it's not good enough to fight the Aston Martins. It might be good enough to fight the Hasses, but no way we're keeping Alonso behind. The fact that we're also keeping Ocon in the running is kind of amazing at this point. But we're going to tune Gasly down a little bit. And we're also going to go ahead and just speed things up a little bit here. Because now there isn't really too much we can do. For Ocon, for Gasly, we just need to make sure that by the time we reach 50 to 40% ERS, we turn it back to neutral. We are also going to turn off the ballast assist. Because again, micromanaging the ERS is kind of something we're going to have to do here, particularly for Ocon. But again, if you want to automate it, put it here. That's fine. There's no negatives really of running the ERS balances, except maybe losing a couple of hundreds a lap, which isn't that much really. And again, we're just kind of pushing here for these first couple of laps just to keep up with the AI. Our energy has also gone fairly low, so we'll turn it to neutral. And at this point, it is for Ocon just surviving. For Gasly, it's kind of similar. And we are also going to be tuning, probably on lap 5, both of these guys down to conserve until we are back to a positive fuel level. There we go, Perez overtakes Ocon, and again, we are not finding the Red Bulls. They are way quicker than us, and you can kind of see it here by Perez just sailing past, uncontested. So Ocon, as long as he finishes in the points today, we will be happy. But yeah, at this point, we're going to turn to conserve, we're going to sit back, we're going to relax, and we're going to allow the race to kind of run its own course for a little while. So by the time we get to our first pit stop here, we have basically fallen down to 10th place. We have fallen out of the points, and it shouldn't be too surprising because once we started getting overtaken, it severely hurt our confidence. We're actually pretty happy that we have been able to keep it at a medium level, and it's unfortunately just how things have been. Now, I would like to push here and pit a little bit earlier than planned, and the reason that is very simple. That way we might be able to undercut the Red Bull ahead, or RB, Ricciardo, not Verstappen and Perez. And the goal behind an undercut is that we pit before them, and by the time that they pit, we will be ahead of them. Basically, once they go in the pit lane, we fly past, then we overtake them off the track, so to speak. That's at least the idea behind it. In our case here, Ocon actually comes out in a very, very nice window where he has about 8 seconds of free air. So it worked out pretty well for us, this strategy so far. And honestly, once we get these tires up to temperature, we're probably going to turn them down to light to save tire as much as possible towards the end. And that way we'll hopefully be more competitive. Now, Gasly is struggling very much so in the same manner that his teammate is. So we're going to have to manage the tires a little bit at this point, and hopefully we can still snatch a couple of points by the end of this. So we've had an incident here with Hulkenberg, where he is just straight up parked in the middle of the road. I assume that he's actually developed a fault that has then escalated, but as you can see here, he is out. It actually looks like he's been probably hit from the back, maybe. But this has actually been a pretty bad time for a safety car for us because we have just pitted. Had we stayed out, we could have taken more advantage. But unfortunately, because of the timing, we really can't. So, but unfortunate, it's going to bunch the pack up again though, and it is going to potentially make it more viable for us to snatch a point here. Also, just as a general rule of thumb, if a safety car is called, it can be a very good idea to pit even if you have like 70 or even 80% left of your tires, because generally the AI will take advantage and pit. You can expect to lose 10 to 15% of your tire while you wait for the safety car to end. So even if you have like 85%, you think you're safe, if the gap is big enough for you to pit under a safety car, it's almost always worth it. Basically what I mean by gap big enough that you can pit without coming out behind, say the car behind. And you can actually check how much time you're expected to lose. You're going to the reports, time considerations, and as you can see under a safety car, we are going to be using 19 seconds to pit. Basically this means we lose 19 seconds to car behind. And generally here, you just save 4 seconds by pitting under a safety car or a virtual safety car, which isn't a lot really. For Gasly, he is still struggling at the back of the pack. There's no surprise there. It's just how things are going to be, particularly when we are slowed down in our development. But it looks like Ocon is still kind of poised to potentially score a point, so we'll do the best that we can to make that happen. Also, it's perfectly fine to run attack or attack and deploy during a safety car because you're very limited on the pace that you can run. So even if you do this, it's not really going to affect your energy. It's not going to affect your tires because you're not allowed to drive any faster than you already are. And here we are on the safety car restart. We are stuck behind Stroll. And honestly, this is one of those times where turning high overgrade aggression on can be very beneficial. Looks like Rick and Alonso have had a little bit of an incident as they both got a yellow stop sign at the same time. This signifies minor damage. Hulkenberg signifies major damage. But yeah, it looks like we just are a little bit too slow here really to keep up with the top 10 teams. But it means that once we get a couple more upgrades, we should be at the very least fighting for a couple of points and getting that 6th place that the board wants. So it's still looking very good here, in my honest opinion. For Gasly, we're going to put him on high overtake aggression because he really should be able to fight the cars around him. And hopefully we can get something done on this straight. It's basically the last chance before we have to turn down the energy usage. And there we are. Now, as I mentioned, as long as it is raining, regenerating fuel is a lot simpler. So pushing right here after safety car is perfectly alright. But for now, again, we're just going to settle in and just try and survive for the most part till the end of this race. Maybe see if we can snatch a point with Ocon, but as you can see, Stroll ahead just seems to be a little bit too quick for us. We've had yet another incident here in the West. Hamilton has had a... Is that Stroll? Has an incident with Stroll. Stroll has been sent onto the grass. And that could be us getting a cheap point here. Or maybe not. Stroll is back, but Ocon is right behind him. So with just 8 laps to go here, looks like we have a very good chance at making something happen. Now, in Stroll's case, he didn't really lose anything in terms of car damage or tire wear by the looks of it. And the main thing here that you actually lose when you have an incident like that is confidence. It basically hits the rock bottom, and that's gonna potentially make him a lot slower. So with just a few laps to go here, we're gonna push our tires a little bit more and see if we might just barely catch up to him. But as you can see, even if we push our tires, it's going to put us in a risky zone. So we're just going to have to try and manage a little bit here. Can't really push too hard and not have tires to get to the end. That kind of defeats the purpose of pushing in the first place. So unfortunately, that incident doesn't give us an easy way to get points. But we should still have a good chance there at maybe getting something done over the next 7 or 8 laps. But there isn't really much we can do from this point. It's just hoping that we take better care of our tires than the AI. We have an advantage over Tsunoda. We have an advantage over Stroll. None of them are probably going to go below 30%, which is where punctures can happen. But we are catching up to them somewhat. And towards the end here, we can definitely push. However, that virtual safety car is causing some issues. Sergeant has crashed out. He has spun and destroyed his car, unfortunately. And what I mean by this virtual safety car has caused us some problems.
Let's keep that gap down.
It's very simple, the fact that we're now going to lose a couple of laps running under the virtual safety car. We're going to be able to recharge, of course, which is a positive thing. But the same can be said for the AI. The AI is also recharging at this point, so it's not really a net positive. And once the virtual safety car is over, well, we can push because we're saving tire now. We still need to close down 2 seconds, and that's going to be difficult. Closing down that time and also catching up, that is going to be a rough thing to do. For Gasly, he has a good chance of getting 15th, which would probably get him a little bit happier. But honestly, Ocon in 11th is fine enough from a mentality perspective. Getting that mentality boost, getting a little bit of extra stats would be a good thing. And unfortunately, we didn't have the best starts. We are 2.2 seconds behind. 1.5, 2.1. It's undecided. But yeah, we're definitely a little bit behind here. And we might be able to actually catch Stroll by the end of this, potentially. Which would be huge. That would be a point. Which would make the board and also the staff very, very happy. Now, while we watch Ocon hunt down here, we are going to be ending this episode after this race. So if there's anything in particular that you feel like I missed, anything you want me to elaborate on, let me know and I'll take it up in the next episode. But for now, let's see what we can do here with Ocon now chasing Stroll. And as mentioned, we should be fine running full attack till the end. 4 more laps. Maybe a little bit too early. We can turn it down to standard a little bit more here. We basically just need to stay somewhat close and go for an attack towards the end of this race. Russell is actually living kind of dangerously. Same with Perez. Maybe we get a lucky puncture here. And honestly, that virtual safety car might actually have saved them a little bit. Never mind. No points for us. Oh, that's so sad.
Understood. We're looking at it. I think you're cool. Let's keep going.
He destroyed the new suspension. He destroyed the new chassis. He destroyed his engine, his gearbox, and his ERS. So I guess next time around, we'll be discussing how to deal with this. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and we'll continue next time, where we go over how to recover after a car crash. Floof, this is for you. Hope you enjoyed. Ocon has already started his vengeance after last year's save. Let's get into this. But yeah, I'm going to end it here. We're not going to be scoring points, let's be perfectly honest. We are going to have to do a little bit of recovery next time around. And also, while I'm at it, as I mentioned, the goal of this save is to be a little bit more educational, a save that you can follow and play along with if you will. So if there's anything that I've been unclear on, anything that you would like me to elaborate more on, please let me know and I'll do my best to do just that. Thank you for watching, hope you've enjoyed, and I hope to see you around next time. Hopefully, with a little less wall banging. Bye bye. Thank you very much. See you later. Bye.